Progress. All right, welcome everyone. So I'm going to give a presentation for the next 4 weeks for seminar presentations on housing authorities. And but before I start, I'd like to welcome everyone, and I'm quite excited about giving this topic. We've been this has been a big discussion for the last few years, and hopefully by the time we're done, we have a better understanding of what housing authorities are in terms of a structure, how they function within communities, and what do they really mean. And again, another reminder, I sent out some disability surveys, so if people have a chance to complete them and send them in to me, that will be great. All right, next slide, please. Oh, there we go. So we have the 4 dates. Thursday, Monday, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, and that's to accommodate other webinars that we have. Next slide there. So the webinar I have 4 areas. So one is an overview of housing authorities, how they function off reserve. We're looking at how organizations off reserve function in terms of housing authorities, housing corporations, how they function, and how we can learn from those from a First Nations perspective. The second one is how to implement housing authorities. That's include, conducting community consultations and moving these through, incrementally through the communities, through the councils. The third one is probably the most important one. It's how do you achieve arm's length relationships from council? Basically, how do you stop the chief from calling the housing authority and say, I need X or I need Y, or I want this person here or that person there, or deal with these issues. So we were talking about in webinar 3. And then webinar 4 is the roles, responsibility, housing authorities, and the collection of rent or user fees and how they are used to sustain revenues for housing authorities. Next there. So what does a housing authority mean? So if you take it in its truest form, it's an incorporated organization under the federal or provincial legislation as either a corporation or a not-for-profit entity. And why is that important? Well, first of all, a not-for-profit entity is a little bit of a misnomer. An organization that's a not-for-profit can make revenues, can make substantial revenues. So for example, FNNBOA, our organization, we generate revenues through a number of our projects, and we have substantial funds in the bank. And those monies that are owned by the corporation, we can use it for investment purposes. The difference between a not-for-profit corporation is that the money has to stay in the corporations and cannot be shared with the shareholders or sent out as dividends. So basically the profits are owned by the corporation and it cannot be divvied to the shareholders. Where a corporation like Ford or any, the largest IBM, shareholders want dividends and the bottom line is always profit, profit, profit. But for a not-for-profit association, profit is a function, but it's not the end-all be. So that's really where we get in the big differences between a corporation and not-for-profit. And why the organization is incorporated federally, it just gives us that governance that we try to function. All right, next, please. So in a First Nation context, an arm's length relationship is a housing management body. It can either be incorporated, and again, we're talking about the advantages of why it should be incorporated. And it's operated on behalf of the owners, which may include the chiefs and councils of the First Nations. So again, it's an arm's length organizations that sometimes they're incorporated or not, but again, the key is how they're structured from a management perspective. Next there, please. So housing authorities off reserves. So I want to spend the next few slides showing how these things really function. So basically all provinces and territories have established housing corporations or housing authorities. Off reserve, they're called housing corporations. They provide a range of programs and services to help people in their jurisdiction with housing needs. A lot of the housing corporations are centered on community-based, serving people in need or people who can't afford the regular homes. The housing corporation manages funds at 3 levels. So they get money from the federal government, they get money from the provincial province. They also get money from the municipalities. So the municipalities, so in Ontario, in Ottawa here, we have the Ottawa Housing Corporation, and they provide public housing. They get funds from the municipality to help house, new immigrants or people who can't afford their own homes. What's interesting, they also manage a lot of programs. So that includes, rent, home repairs, renovations. They're responsible for construction, building their own homes, procurement, making sure the homes are efficient. They police their own, they have their own security systems. They reinvest in housing, they educate the tenants. They basically follow the rules and regulations under the provincial tenancy or landlord legislation. What's most important, all these programs have the same goal as a housing authority on reserve. So when we look at all those programs, those are exactly what we would want to see in a First Nations communities. We want to be responsible for home repairs, renovations, investments in housings, make sure they build energy efficiently, be responsible for procurement. So there's no difference between off reserve or on reserve in town in terms of housing programs. Next, please. What's interesting is the corporations off reserve, they all function at arm's length by institution, by developing policies that relate to the decision making for the tenants and the service and the units they serve. So in other words, they have they have an organization that works separately from the city of Ottawa. They have a board of governance, and they institute a number of policies to clearly articulate how their decisions are made, how tenants receive housing, how this dividend, how they are going to service units. So it's all governed by core policies and governance by that board. So for example, in Saskatchewan, there's a Saskatchewan Housing Corporation. And this again is similar to chief and councils, right? It's not directly involved. So the Saskatchewan Housing Corporation, they're not directly involved in the day-to-day management of decisions of, for example, the Prince Albert Housing Corporation or any of the smaller towns. The selection of the tenants and servicing of the units, the provincial government has nothing to do with how they're functioning at the local levels. So the arm's length relationship is clearly defined through a series. They have operating agreements, they have shareholders agreements, there's corporate bylaws, they have waiting lists in these housing corporations, they have funding agreements, they all absolutely have rental agreements, and they all have rental agreements that clearly articulate the roles and responsibilities of the tenant and their responsibilities and the landlord and their responsibilities. So if you look at how that's structured in many First Nations communities, these are the same agreements that we want, but in fact, many they don't exist. And if you don't have those structures in housing, it's hard to really get your head around a housing authority because a lot of those structures don't really exist now. And that's where we start talking about housing authorities. It's hard to conceptualize how they would function in an on-reserve setting. Next. So for example, if you look at, so here's a breakdown of the Saskatchewan Housing Commission Corporation. So they have the Saskatchewan Housing Corp, and they create a local series of local housing authorities. So one in Saskatoon, there's one in Regina, there's one in Moose, that should be Moose Jaw, Prince Albert, and there's 270 other local housing authorities. All these local housing authorities all operate independent of the Saskatchewan Housing Corporation. And while they may share similar bylaws, they may share similar agreements because it's all within the province, they all operate by their own board and governance, and they serve their local communities. Next. This is a little more detailed of a housing commission, or sorry, housing corporation at a local level. So this was actually modeled off of Saskatoon and a bit of Prince Albert. So you see at the top there, it should be a board, and then there's a CEO or the director. And in the housing authority, there's a whole series of other activities. So you have, for example, the human resources, and you can see their responsibility, hiring, wages and salaries. They have human rights policies, they recruit, hire, fire staff. You can see the corporate side. They have, fraud prevention. They do some investigation, security, operational policy, or operational property management. You can see they're responsible for claims, the maintenance. They introduce, for example, non-smoking policies. They're responsible for repairs, and on and on. You can see how the different subcommittees work, or sub-departments under each one. What's important to point out here is that not all housing authorities would have these types of departments. So they would have, for example, the operational property manager. He would be both probably the property manager and the operational policy management for the tenants. So what we see here is also the same function you would see in a much larger or much smaller. It's the same operations, but probably one person or two people will be functioning all of those functions. So these are the core operations of a housing authority. And again, if you look under the key one, tenant agreements, the waiting list, tenant complaint processes, accessibility policies, senior and elder tenants, unit repairs, prevention, maintenance, inspections before the tenants, vacancy management, tenant needs and concerns. Those issues are exactly the same issues that would be, under a housing authority within a First Nations community. There'd be no difference at all. Next. So just going through a couple of the questions here as we're moving on. Yes, I will share the presentations with the group and a bunch of other documents as well, which I'll talk about later. But yes, I'll be sharing that as well. So one of the big issues within a housing corporation is revenue generation. These housing corporations survive by generating revenue. Revenue generation is an important element for housing off reserve. These sources include rent from the tenants, rent from government sources, so that's shelter allowance, senior supplements, other sources including investments, for example, laundry machines, advertising, communication contracts, internet providing, they do cost recovery, they do technical services. So there's a number of ways of how these housing corporations sustain themselves. So for example, a housing authority, they generate only up to about 44 to 52% of their total revenues from rent. The other 45% is from government revenues, such as shelter allowance payments. And just give an example here, in a housing corporation in Ottawa, 38% is collected from rent and 61% is collected from other government sources. So while rent is important, it's also through shelter allowance. And if you think about how this revenue generation will work in on reserve, so we do have shelter allowance payments. The challenge is, collecting a user fee or rent to offset those costs, because housing corporation, they own their homes, right? The corporation owns these homes. They have to sustain those homes in terms of paying the mortgages. So if they build a home, they have to collect the revenues in order to pay for that. Next, please. So what have we learned from housing authorities or housing corporations off reserve? Well, the first one is, you need a corporate structure with clear roles and responsibilities. Why is that important? Well, you can gain financing from banks and other lending institutions. It is very hard for a bank, any financial lending corporation to lend money to a non-corporate structure. So what that means is if a First Nation community is going to set up a housing authority and it doesn't have its corporate structure, and we're talking about what that means, then the banks are very hesitant to lend money because there's no clear corporate entity of how it's going to function, governance, code of ethics, how the decision is going to be made, conflict of interest. They want to see all that information. So that leads us to a third point. The agreements need to have clear policies and procedures to ensure arm's length relations from chiefs and councils. Again, accountability, performance, how is going to function. So if you're going to set up a housing authority, what we learned from off reserve is they have agreements on absolutely everything. How the board functions, the board of the directors' responsibility. They have board liability insurance to make sure everything's protected. 4, housing authorities operate separately from provincial housing corporation, which is the same as housing authorities must operate separately from chiefs and councils. So what we learned from this is, well, you have a provincial housing corporation like Saskatchewan, all the local housing authorities, they operate separately from the province. So similar to a chief and council. So if a chief and council wants to set up a housing authority, they have to set up at arm's length, independent, their own housing authority, separate apart from the chiefs and councils. 5, tenancy relationships include the charging collections of rent is the key to the financial success of any authorities. We know throughout the years that many of the First Nation communities that go into third-party receivership under third-party review, we know from our research that that's really a lot to do with bad housing decisions. And so under a housing authority, it has to sustain itself. It has to be responsible for collecting enough funds to pay to offset the mortgage cost. Next, please. So another lesson we learned, the housing authority needs to provide information to chiefs and council in a community that includes annual budgets, annual information on returns, auditing financial statements, financial plans, strategic plans, performance measures. So basically, what we've learned is a local housing authority off reserve has to provide all this same documentation, and they have to submit it back to the province. So what we learn on reserve, the same thing will be the application. You have to have audited financial statements, multi-year plans, strategic plans, basically demonstrating how the authority will function. Number 7 lesson we learned is revenue include both rent collected from tenants and from tenants that are receiving the government subsidies. Charging for repairs and selling advertising is another source of revenues. So for example, as we know, if a home gets damaged, the tenant should be issued the bill, and those costs should be offset to cover the cost and revenues, to make sure that it's being paid for properly. And again, we're talking about further, but the challenge a lot of the First Nations community is the issue relating to as housing is a treaty right. And some believe they do not have to pay rent based on housing as treaty right. Well, to discuss that as a forum now, a big debate. If you call it rent, call it user fees, at the end of the day, housing is not free. And somehow, a lot of the communities under housing authority has to work with the community and the chiefs and councils to ensure that rent's being collected. So what happens, the housing authority also helps to depoliticize the housing allocations in the community. So the housing authority takes on the control of the house, and no longer can chief and council say, well, if you hire, if you vote for me, I'll reduce your rent, or if you vote for me, there will be no rent, or if you vote for me, it has something to do with the rental allocations. Those platforms can no longer exist under a housing authority. 7, next please. So one thing we also learned, not all communities are able to implement a housing authority. And why? Because usually a housing authority off reserve is responsible for many 30, 40, 50, 60 homes. And what happens in a lot of the smaller communities, there's just not enough homes to place them in a housing authority. Basically, the housing stock's really low. In these cases, however, what we've learned is that a housing authority can become part and parcel of a tribal council or work in partnership with other communities. One of the discussions is that why can't a tribal council that has, for example, anywhere, let's say 14 or 22 members of that council, of all communities that are small, have a tribal council housing authority, and then they become responsible for housing within those 14 or 20 communities. Again, it's a major step forward, but it's one way to look at how to ensure housing authorities in some of these smaller communities. Number 9, the successful creation of a housing authority requires recognition, understanding, and willingness by the leadership of First Nations on the need to create a housing authority. And I think that's really the big question, is how does leadership move forward to say, yeah, I like the idea of a housing authority? Because on the one hand, if they're acknowledging the need for a housing authority, they will lose, a lot of the chiefs and councils, complete control on the allocation and housing and the politicalization of the housing allocations. Those communities that have actually implemented housing authority, and it's not a few, or those that actually no longer use housing as the political vote, are actually doing much better and have much sounder housing than those communities that use housing as politics. So a housing authority is a major leap forward to break away the politicalization of the housing within the communities. So number 10, First Nation communities must ensure they have the capacity, so the ability to acquire, use, and sustain the various resources that it requires to carry out the mandate. Housing authorities and many of the communities, and it relates to the size, may have a challenge acquiring the proper capacity. That is, hiring somebody who can manage a housing authority, or hiring outside experts such as accountants to come in to provide audited statements. Next there. So some of the obstacles for First Nations, based on what we have, is communities want to move away from status quo. So we know status quo for a lot of communities are not working. We have very poor housing conditions. We have overcrowding. Can a housing authority help to alleviate the existing status quo? I mentioned already depoliticalization of housing. That's one of the main essential arguments under a housing authority is how to remove the politics from housing. Some communities have been successful, others are still, caught in the allocations and the management of housing at a political level. The other big one is housing is being treated more so as an investment in capital. It's no longer based on social housing. Homes are no longer built upon shelter allowance allocations or people on shelter. So if you have 5 people on shelter, well, those 5 people, we should get Section 95 because we can get SA payments to offset those costs. So no longer that becomes an argument for housing investment. It becomes an entity of a housing authority saying that we have these revenues, we can borrow money, and let's build these homes. Yes, some would be for Section 95, but others will be offset for regular rental investments. And then the big point is revenues, which means collecting rents. Somehow housing authorities have to be able to collect, call it rent, call it user fees, but they have to sustain themselves in order to function. And if you cannot collect a user fee or collect any forms of rent, then housing authorities just don't function because they need that as their revenue generators. So those are some of the key points. Open up for discussion if there's any points to be raised or. So I'll unmute.
Can I go first?
Go ahead.
At the 6 nations that belong to DOTC, Ojibwe Tribal Council, they don't have a history. In one First Nation, a lady told me they've never paid rent. That was possible because and that made the money for them.
Hey, just one sec here. I'm gonna mute all and I'm gonna unmute you there. So there we go. Sec here. 1 second. 1 second. Where I lost you there, Harry. Harry Miller. There we go. There we go. So, so basically, to ask questions, I muted everybody so we don't get feedback. And if you unmute your mic, then I can see who's asking the question. So sorry about that, Harry. Go ahead.
That's okay. Yeah, the First Nations I know, the people are not used to paying rent. Matter of fact, in one First Nation, they had a casino that made the money for them, and indeed, for years that worked, and that paid the rent for them. Well, suddenly the casino kind of collapsed, and now they're faced with a problem of needing a substitute. So they're thinking of manufacturing or whatever. So there'll be a time lag here when they find another way to get money to pay the rent for these people. However, in that very same community, the members have altogether decided, yes, you know what? It's probably time we started paying rent. And they're starting small, I think at $100 a month, with the idea that it will increase as time goes on. But this is a gigantic issue for people to pay rent when they haven't paid rent before.
Good, yeah, I think that's right across from coast to coast to coast in a lot of the communities. How do you change the the behavior to pay rent, especially when people believe it's a treaty right as well, and I think that's a lot of the obstacles that a lot of the communities are facing now. I know in some of the communities they're using user fees and they're trying to assess, there's even the bigger questions, and we're talking about it in the third webinar, like how do we even determine the rental levels within some of the First Nations communities? So Roxanne, did you have a comment?
Yes, I did, John. I just seen incredible progress in the area of economic sustainability. Myself, personally, in the last 5 years, I've been having a lot of discussions with First Nations in regards to raising the rent. So I think it's important to honor the educational background that we've done on this issue, but to never stop talking about how important it is that people have a responsibility to their own community and we as housing administrators, we need to change our dialogue. And I find I'm telling people that it's a huge honor to contribute to your own community. It's not only an honor, but an obligation and a responsibility that we carry as First Nations. So I encourage every one of us who works in housing to start changing our terminology. And I think when we do that, we will move forward on this, because right now across the country, there are several First Nations who successfully charge and collect rent. That's it, John.
Yeah, no, and well spoken, Roxanne. And again, you're across the country, coast to coast to coast. You see what's happening, and there is a strong movement. And those communities that are moving forward, you can see the change that are happening in the community. There's better
Absolutely.
housing.
Absolutely.
And they have access to capital. So those that are being built on the pedestal, the banks are reaching out to lend these First Nations money because they see the change, they see the investment that the people are making in themselves. Yeah. Just going to comments here. Arm-like relationship seems to be key. However, is it easy to achieve? I'm going to talk about that in the third revenue. We're going to detail. But suffice to say is it's easy to change if everybody believes in the policies and processes that are put in place. So I'll talk about that more in the third webinar. We have another question. How can we deal with the mandate of no members left behind and still manage the revenues to pay for the operating cost? Housing does not come free. And again, I think, Roxanne touched on that as well, is, there becomes a shift in education, a shift in understanding on the importance that they have to start providing some type of user fees. I know in one of the, go ahead. Yeah. Roxanne?
Well, I was just thinking, I do believe in my heart too. I also believe in the concept of no member left behind. But I think when we make a statement like that as First Nations, we then have to own it. And that may mean that some of us who can do more have to do more. And, I find when I hear statements like that, I do embrace it because I think that reflects our culture. But I also think that we need to sit down and we need to take a statement like that and figure it out from a financial point of view and also from our policy point of view. How can we achieve that? And I think we can, but it does mean some of us will make greater sacrifices, maybe not forever, but for a shorter period of time. And I think all societies want to do that because nobody wants to see their elders left out in the cold or their children. And none of us as First Nations want to see homelessness as an issue. So whoever posted that question, I think it's really great that your community's thinking about that. But I would encourage you to go back to the community and now and say, how do we achieve that goal?
I know in a couple of the communities that we talk about housing authorities and rental, and you can see the concerns on many of the families' faces, the community members' faces. And I remember one of the elder ladies came up, and it was in northern Saskatchewan, came up to me. She said, I don't have a problem paying rent or a user fee. But she said the problem we have is how we don't know how to budget. We don't know how to financially allocate our monies to a rent. And so after talking to her, for that community, we actually implemented a program for budgeting, and we geared it towards teenagers so that we wouldn't center on the adults, but all the adults come. And budgeting is an issue for everybody. Like it's not geared to people on or off reserve. I have many close friends that don't have two dimes to rub, and they're basically check to check, and anything like a COVID actually is really concerned for them. So it's, budgeting is a huge issue for everybody. And so what we've been talking about, and we're doing in the fourth webinar is, maybe you may have to introduce a budgeting program on how to budget and how to make those sacrifices. So
I agree.
So we have another comment, is housing authorities is not just a management body, it needs to have a wraparound model, holistic approach that supports members to be self-reliant and self-dependent, and where the owners to rent responsibilities, empowered education. Absolutely agree. It's just not a management body. It is theoretically, legally a management body, but it is a holistic body, because then the housing authority becomes the hub. It becomes the main source for everything relating to housing, and you have to try to educate. And and in some housing authorities, they actually even have guidance counseling, life sessions that they provide, so they become more the social side as well. Totally agree, especially off reserve. I know the housing authority had a chance to look at the one in Ottawa here, and they have mental health training. They have social workers on staff. They have they work with the health boards as well. So it really is holistic, no doubt about it. Any other comments, concerns?
John, there's one about the minimum number of rental housing units.
Yeah. Good question. Well, so when we were doing our research on housing authorities, we know, so for example, some of the smaller communities that have, maybe 20 homes, 30 homes, I'm just not sure if that would be really viable for a housing authority to take place. And this is where I've been trying to, focus concerns on tribal councils working with the smaller communities. So a lot of these, like as I mentioned before, a lot of these tribal councils have, 10, 9 communities, 12 communities. And many of these communities are very small, and maybe 20 homes, 30 homes, and you can't do it. It's really hard to do a housing authority with that number. However, if collectively they all form under the tribal council, then you would have an authority that has better purchasing power, have better access to revenues, can manage those communities. But the chiefs and councils locally will have to allow the housing authority to function. And I'll go one step further, that if you have all the tribal councils, so for example, Saskatchewan, I believe, has 22 tribal councils, 75 First Nations. There, can't remember, what, 15? I'm sort of losing track here. So if all the tribal councils form their own housing authority and then all those tribal councils form one provincial housing authority, I would think that will be such an incredible powerhouse and a change for housing within the communities and within that province to happen. Because then you're demonstrating you're depoliticizing housing, you get access to capital, you get access to financial funding, you have better control on housing within the province through the authorities. I'm just not sure the other way, if you have a provincial housing authority and to control all the local provinces, I just don't see that working at all. And I think it's sort of like the bit of the Hicks model. I just don't see a provincial housing authority working, because I know myself, I don't see a provincial body telling the local community how to function. And that's where one of the challenges becomes of how to set up these housing authorities. Again, that's just my thoughts on, how the larger housing authorities without the tribal council's buy-in, you can't really function. So we have another communities here. We have a delegate authority executive. So we have delegated authority to the executive director, to the housing coordinator. I'm not sure what Verna, do you want to clarify what your points are on that? Unclick your mic. Rivera, sorry. Okay, I think, go ahead.
Is Vera still there?
Vera? Let's see if I can unclick her here.
John, this is Rudy here. Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead, Rudy.
I have a question out here in Kamloops. We've just gone through a new manager for the housing department here in Kamloops. Now, the last time you were out here, you were introducing the housing authority, and it seemed like the last manager was game for it and trying to move it to council. Now we've got a situation where we have a new manager, and she's strapped with the budget, and she has basically just put the whole housing authority on hold. And I think to some degree, she really isn't aware of what we had or you had proposed in an earlier conversation with their department. So I guess my question to you then is, how do we get this back on the rails again?
Oh, good question. Well, that actually really, if we even back up, we held we had two community meetings, and the community overwhelmingly supported the housing authority. And and if I recall, the board, we even passed a board minute or a board decision to move towards the housing authority. So at that time, I know that the council was on board, the community was on board, and the housing was on board, and then we have a change in personality. So, and I think that's a real problem. A lot of the communities are that you have one person that's there, they're gone, and the memory goes, and it goes away with that person. So that's one of the challenges with a lot of these communities. And I think that's a frustration with a lot of us in the communities, is that every 3 years, if you get a change, then it's all, you have to start from scratch again, like literally start from the beginning. So in this case, I can actually resend out some of the documents and probably follow up with them, but that's not uncommon. What we're finding across is that once there's a change in personality or a change in structure or new council, it starts right back to day one again. And it's really frustrating. And that's why a housing authority, if it's incorporated, it works independent from any change in council or any change in personalities. At least you have a structure there already.
So what can we do from our association at this end to gently move this along again? They have put new people in most of the department. They have a gentleman in there that's handling their RTO, and he's really in some ways clamped down on collecting rent and moving this thing along. But I think our new young manager would benefit from maybe a call from you.
Yeah,
So,
we can do that.
great, I'll leave it in your hands.
Yeah, who is the chief again, Rudy? Is it still?
No, it's not. I offhand I can't remember. It's one of the Godfreysons, and I believe in housing is it's Sharon Godfreyson. She's
Right.
incredible. She's an incredible woman.
Yeah.
Super really orientated, and has lots of degrees. So she's somebody we need to talk to.
Okay, I can follow up with you after the call. So,
Thank you.
okay. Another comment here is the advantage of tribal council authorities is that the members learn consistency. If more than one community is encouraged change, it's easier to understand and support. That was from Roxanne. And again, wholly agree. One of the challenges with existing housing departments is that is the inconsistency in terms of decisions and how paperwork flows. So the housing authority actually brings to light consistency and formality. And I know it's hard to talk about formalities and processes and bureaucracy, but sometimes in housing that becomes essential. All right, background noise, unmute. You gotta mute all again. There we go. And I should still be free. Yes. Any other comments before we? Oh, one moment. Let me unmute. There you go.
I think Rasika's trying to
Hi,
get on.
can you hear me, John?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so I represent Sawasan First Nation, and we are a self-governed treaty First Nation that's been has had a treaty since 11 years now, and I think we are actually right now we are in the process of doing a comprehensive housing strategy, as well as the big pillar part of that is the formation of the housing authority.
Okay.
But my question is more to do with a specific need that TFN has, and that can be identified clearly in the role and responsibility. But however, I wanted to know from your experience, if have you found any housing authorities in the off-reserve context that not only do asset managing of all the non-market or affordable rental housing assets that they're building and owning, but also play a facilitating role for individual member housing needs. So whether it is new housing houses being built by individual members, or it's renovations of existing housing, any kind of upgrades. So basically, like the responsibility itself can be categorized, broadly into two. One is the clear-cut asset managing, which most nonprofit societies and housing authorities do. But the other part is actually dealing with individual member housing needs and being a facilitator, helping members through the process of actually planning, achieving, getting a mortgage, hiring the right folks, taking them through the process, and all within the context of being the approving authority. So like avoiding the conflict of interest, being the approving authority, because the government goes through the building permit approvals for individual housing. At the same time, the members do need hand-holding. So I would like to know from your experience if you have seen or know of a housing authority that does both these aspects.
Excellent question. To answer your question, the housing authorities or officers, they are only responsible for their housing mandate. So they would build for the housing corporation for their use. What you mentioned is an argument that we've been basically why FNNBOA established back in 2003, and that is, the authority having jurisdiction, the role and responsibility of chief and council to make sure that when homes are being built within the communities by individuals, that they have the proper permit systems and inspections taking place. So generally, a housing authority would not be responsible for that. That would be chiefs and council housing department. So the housing, you would still have a housing department or an engineering department that would do that, holding the hands of individual members. And they would make sure that the plans are being reviewed, the proper inspections are taking place, and making sure that that home is being built in accordance with national or provincial building codes. So the housing authority would not take that on.
No, I think I need to clarify this. So, in context, to us from First Nation, we already have a robust land department that has, the building officials, inspectors, development planners, architects, engineers. So we have a robust team. So my question was not about being an approving authority. However, often hand-holding or facilitating or helping members with their individual housing needs is done by land staff because it's expected as member services. And I'm saying that that could pose a lot of times a conflict of interest because sometimes it's just facilitating, sometimes the member may expect a staff to project manage their housing, individual housing project, which becomes again a little bit of a conflict of interest because the staff and this department is also in charge of reviewing the plans, making sure it's code compliant, approving the building permits, which is the primary, intention to make sure that, the structures are built safely. So what we are trying to achieve here is the housing authority will manage the assets that are rental assets owned by the TFN government.
Yep.
That's straightforward. But at the same time, the EC expects that this housing authority has perhaps some element or a small component that plays a facilitating role to help individual members because individual members are not experienced with their own home building and construction and a lot of technical stuff that's needed. So in that case, the housing authority is playing a sort of a dual role, mainly asset managing, but on the side, they're also expected to provide this kind of support, facilitating and helping individual members. And my question was, have you encountered such a model through your experience anywhere else?
No, I haven't. I just thinking of all the housing authorities across the country. Mm-hmm. Generally, a housing authority would be managing their mandated housing responsibilities. But that being said, as a revenue generator for the housing authority, that there's nothing stopping a department to provide that advice and charge the band member for those hand-holding services. So basically a project management, hold your hand so that the individual build that home. There's nothing stopping, the housing authority to do a charge for that services. So it could be a good revenue generator, that type of activity. Or they just hire a project manager to help them hold their hands.
Yeah, that's a possibility, but I think in most cases it's expected as a complimentary service because there is it basically comes under member services, and most of the members are not very experienced with any of the technical stuff that's needed to build a house. So, and
are the individuals holding the mortgage? Or is the chief and council?
Yeah, so they're required to qualify for a mortgage and absolutely go through the process of getting the house designed, as well as submitting the documents that are needed for a building permit approval. All that process is standard and it's pretty regulated because BC Building Code needs to be complied with. So all that is followed strictly. Yep. However, there's a lot of hand holding or help or support that's needed because, of course, most of these members are building or getting their house built for the first time, and it's like any other person who's trying to figure out not just the process. Explaining the process of approval is easy, but actually implementing it, and I guess helping them through the implementation.
Yeah, no, it's great that they're making that leap. I have your email. There's some, so to answer your question, no, I don't, but there's nothing stopping the authority to provide that background. I'll send you some documents that we have for people building new homes and things they need to, think about and who to hire. So we have a few documents I can send you for resources as well, if you want.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, just some last comments here. One comment, the Housing Authority Act on behalf of the band shall notify and borrow by means of registered mail. Oh yeah, so yeah, the Housing Authority, they actually become the collector of rents, right? So they must, they take on the debt, they collect the debt. And so they become the main person for rent collection. And another question is, I'll send the presentation out by emails. So for next week, if you can, I will send a link to the FNNBOA. We did a podcast, first season on housing authorities. And I will send that out, and I hope people will listen to it. That will give us, it's a great presentation for housing authority, which is functioning in northern Manitoba. And then that's for next week. And then we have a couple manuals and other reports I'll be distributed as well to help with the background for the next 3 sessions. So some advanced reading materials, lots of reading materials. So, all right. Thank you, everyone. And we'll talk on Monday. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
John, turn the recording off for sure.
Yeah. Bye.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.